Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of Compassion and Courage, Conversations in Healthcare. I'm your host, Marcus Engel. This is the podcast where we teach compassionate communication, provide perspective, and inspire resilience. So I want to tell you a little story here about somebody that I've come across in the last couple of months who has really changed my perspective and my viewpoint and has given me a lot of inspiration. And that person is my guest today. Her name is Susan Farren. Hi, Sue. Thank you for being with me.
Hi, Marcus. Thanks for letting me be part of this.
So I don't want to talk because your story and the work that you are doing is so incredibly valuable, and I'm passionate about it. You're obviously super passionate about it. And I kind of want to just turn this into Susan Farren Unleashed. If that's okay, because you have so much to share. I have gained so much from your podcast. And I want to encourage listeners, if you are a first responder or if you love a first responder, we're talking police, we're talking EMS, EMTs, paramedics, emergency room folk. If you love one of these people, if they're in your life, please, please, please go pause this recording, get that individual and listen to this recording with them. I've got a lot of first responders in my life, and I cannot wait to share with them the work that you're doing. So Sue, I feel like I've talked too much. You're a paramedic, retired, and now you are changing the world. So let's start back in the paramedic days, can we?
Sure, absolutely.
Tell me,
You want me
tell me
just
how
to
you,
launch into it?
jump into it, please, because I've listened to your stories and I know how fascinating they are. So I just love you to jump in. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, and I want to just offer this as I'm on this podcast and sharing with people from the industry, whether you're dispatch, law enforcement, or all the things that Marcus mentioned, that there is no comparative suffering. So my story is no better or worse than anybody else's. It's just my story. So I want to just give that as a sort of preemptive strike that I don't want to, this isn't a bragamony, it's just my testimony. So with that being said, Marcus, what people don't always recognize is a lot of us get into this industry because of our backgrounds. And for me, that background was having alcoholic parents and a drug-addicted mother who no one would know that because she was an ICU and ER nurse, so people would have seen her professionally and respected her, not knowing what was going on in her life in the background, and subsequently the lives of myself and my brother being raised in that environment. She would die when I was 17, and I would go into an industry unbeknownst to me that was directly connected to the way I had grown up. I was creating stability out of chaos. And that's how a lot of us end up in this industry, although we don't know it. Oftentimes it's affected by our childhoods and our ability to be hypervigilant, hyper-aware, able to create, like I said, stability out of chaos. It feels familiar, and that's where that word comes from, right, is family. So I grew up. Go
I'm
ahead.
so fascinated. Can I ask you about that? I'm so fascinated because I just want to reiterate this, that you're saying people choose to go into first responder careers often based on a dysfunctional childhood.
Yeah, or a broken childhood. And I don't even want to say, and I can say that a lot of first responders will joke about this. We don't choose the career chooses us. And the career chooses us because it feels familiar. And I say that very cautiously, especially when speaking to people from my industry, because we pride ourselves on being strong and competent and aware. And so talking about a dysfunctional childhood, it's not true for everyone. I would guesstimate about 80% of us come out of these environments. There are certainly some career, or I should say generational first responders, right? Mom or dad was in the industry, or military. And sometimes it's just a choice because of their background in team sports, things like that can draw them into it. But a lot of times it's what I was just talking about. So with that foundation laid, I would grow up as in that environment. And when my mom died when I was 17, I would take criminal law in school, but get really invited to try out an emergency responder course that led me to EMT school, which I loved. it was like, oh my gosh, I'm home. Because quite literally, I was.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
I would spend my whole career on the ambulances. I started as a paramedic in an area called West Oakland, which was a very violent and drug addicted area. And I just mean that crack cocaine was on the streets. So it was killing a lot of people, and a lot of people were killing each other. And so my career was really born in this very, very difficult and traumatic environment. And then I would, change locations and do a lot of what we do in this industry is I would distract myself. I would promote, I would change locations to try to find some peace and serenity in my life. I would end up in areas like San Francisco and San Jose, which were also very busy areas. But eventually, I would transition into becoming a clinical manager. So I would provide oversight to other paramedics and first responders to help them, refine their skills and do a good job. So that was really my whole career. And like I mentioned, or you may have mentioned at the beginning, I did that for off and on 31 years, I think, while also getting married and having a family, a brood full of babies, 5 kids in the mix.
Wow, that's awesome. And I have heard your conversations with your daughter Bailey on your podcast, which is First Responders Resiliency podcast. And I cannot highly recommend this podcast enough. So yeah, you got 5 kids and you're working 40-hour weeks in emergency medical services
Yeah, or more, because
or more.
oftentimes it's shift work. Yeah,
Wow. Okay, so I remember hearing you say that you felt whenever you retired, which I believe is medical retirement, that
correct.
you felt like you got out of the industry, quote unquote, of EMS, first responder, first respondership. Is that a word?
Sure, it is now.
It is now. Yeah, you felt like you got out of your career virtually unscathed. I believe is a word that you used.
That's true.
Meaning what to you at that point? So give us like what do you see in a lot of first responders as their lives or their careers are nearing retirement, or does it
Yeah.
even get that far often?
Well, that's a really good question, because a lot of the people that I had grown up with the industry, and I would say a lot because this is what stands out, is how many of my partners had taken their lives, which at this point is probably more than a dozen. How many of my partners had died early of strokes and heart attacks and cancer. How many of my partners were divorced? Tons and tons of divorce. How many of my partners were addicted or misusing substances just because they were trying to sort of distract from the pain or numb the pain? How many of my partners had struggled with depression and isolation and sometimes domestic violence? And so when I say came out unscathed, I was still married. I had a happy home. I loved my children. I had survived without being sick, depressed, divorced. I felt like I had come out on the other side and was grateful for the career. I mean, it was a really traumatic experience in a lot of ways, but it also was very rewarding, right? That's you take the good with the bad.
And then,
And then and then in 2013, I would find out that I was going to be going through an unwanted divorce. And that process began, actually, I'd say 2014. And I was going to have to get a new career because I was a contractor, oftentimes to the fire departments where I had no benefits. And all of my benefits would be coming through my his fire department job. So all of a sudden, I wasn't going to have benefits. I was going to have to go get a new job. And I ended up going back to Oakland, where my career had begun. And at least I felt, okay, this is not the way I wanted my story to end. I did not want to be another divorced person from the industry. I was 100% sure my husband and I would never go through that. And yet, here it was. And so I got a great job down in Alameda County and felt really good about it. This is now at 2016 that I have arrived down there. And 5 months after I started working down there, I began to urinate blood. And everything in my life changed. Not only was I going through the unwanted divorce, and anybody who's listening who's gone through these kinds of trials in their lives know that divorce is like being dragged behind a truck. But that was really painful. But then to have this on top of that, and this actually happened on Easter weekend that I started urinating blood, and that came 24 hours later. I was in for an ultrasound, and they would find a tumor in my right kidney. And initially, that was a pretty easy diagnosis and a pretty easy conversation with the surgeon. They thought it was isolated. They were going to just take it out lickety-split, sort of laparoscopically, and I'd be back to work in a couple of weeks. So I was navigating these things and saying, okay, well, at least the good news is they see a lot of these and they'll get it right out. But that isn't what happened, as you know. That same day that they had told me they were going to remove it laparoscopically, the surgeon had, after the phone call, gone through the rest of my scan and found what he believed to be a mass in my liver. So when I went in to meet with him the next day, he told me, the short story is, he told me that they believed that this was not isolated to my kidney, that it had probably started in my chest or my colon, and it had metastasized to my liver, and I had a year to live. And now they were going to take me down to San Francisco, resect my liver. I don't even know what that means, by the way. They were going to take out a part of all of my kidney, and they were going to start me on hospice. And nothing I will tell anybody with a year to live, with 5 kids, with kids that range from 12 to 19, while I am literally 2 weeks away from being divorced.
That's a kick in the gut, right?
Right?
I mean, how many times you got to get punched in the face, right?
Apparently more than once.
Apparently, yeah.
So the story of that transition for me was that my divorce became final 2 weeks before I went in for surgery. They had done some more scans on me, chest x-rays, dyes in my body, CT scans, whatever it was, MRIs, trying to figure out where this cancer had started, how it had spread, what was the best chance I had for survival. And what they discovered was that I had what's called a hemangioma on my liver. It was a birthmark that in the scan looked like a cancer mass. And so the surgeon called me and told me that, but he wasn't 100% sure. So he went ahead and opened me up, and I did not have to go down to San Francisco. They did that here locally. I took out a portion of my kidney and that tumor, and then checked the rest of my belly to make sure there was no hidden cancer, which there was not. And that was a miracle. I was so grateful for that, what I call my stay of execution. And they sewed me back up, and unbeknownst to me, I wouldn't know this for many, many weeks, they had paralyzed a portion of my abdominal muscle in the process. They had cut a nerve bundle during the surgery. And so 6 or 7 weeks later, I would discover that I could not sit for extended periods of time because that muscle was paralyzed. But that wasn't even the part of the story that sort of makes this evolution interesting for me. What happened was 3 days after my operation, one of the doctors came into my room and he said, "We see a lot of this in first responders." And I said, "You see a lot of what?" And he said, "Organ cancer." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" Like, I knew what we struggled with. I just talked about it at the beginning of the podcast. Everybody who's in the industry knows what we struggle with. But there had never been a comment about organ cancer. There has been conversation recently about carcinogens in firefighters' turnouts and what's in wildland, the soils with the chemicals, and what's in buildings and structures, and those things are carcinogens. But nothing about organ cancer related to the industry. And that's where this whole story began.
So now there's so many aspects and layers to what you're talking about. And I want to move this into the work you're doing now because it's so important. But I kind of have to ask the follow-up questions here. I mean, you're sitting on not cancer, but as you said, a stay of execution. And yet that takes a huge emotional toll on someone, especially somebody who's also walking through divorce at this time. what was the hope that you held on to during that time?
That I would live long enough
The
to see my
kids, I
children.
assume. Yeah.
Yep. That my children would have a mother when they got married, which I didn't. That they would have a mother that could be there for their children. It was 100% about staying alive for my children.
Well, you did it. You did it.
I did
And
it.
now you're
Yeah.
changing the world. Now this is where things get really interesting. I want to set this up too by I don't want to give any specifics because I didn't ask about specifics, but I did want to share with listening audience that I have a friend who recently went through a training that changed him in ways that I haven't seen in decades for the better. And he immediately got done with his training and said, the person you need to reach out to, Marcus, is Susan Farren. And that's how I entered this story. But the story for you, changing the everything from working in ambulance work to now doing what you're doing. So, okay, bring us up to speed then.
Okay. So the goal is to stay alive, right? To live long enough to see my children grow up. And the interesting thing is I have to go 2 years after this original surgery to be considered clean. So you're not given a long-term prognosis of being healthy until you've gone 2 years without cancer. And really what happens, I'm going to create a little bit of a story here for people to understand because I think we may address this later. But when I got out of the hospital and then we discovered that my belly was paralyzed when I tried to return to work, I actually, when I first got out of the hospital, the first thing I did was I Googled organ cancer first responders because I'd never heard that before. And I just found a medical journal or medical article and a medical annual review. And I read this article and it was talking about the fact that there was a correlation to the industry and first responders getting organ cancer, specifically around the constant accumulation of adrenaline and cortisol in their systems. And then I started reading about other things that were affecting first responders, right? The strokes and the heart attacks. And then that led to another article and another article. And over a period of weeks, I had begun to sort of compile this information that showed that the work we did was actually killing us. And nobody was aware of that enough that they could put it together. But it was going to kill us in different ways. It could kill us through organ cancer. It could also destroy us emotionally with things like divorce and addiction. And I'm not suggesting that everyone's going to die because of doing the work. What I'm suggesting is the very thing that I discovered when I was researching this is if stress is the number one contributing factor to disease, and it is, you can read that all over anywhere, then reducing stress is the number one contributing factor to reducing disease. And what I really wanted to know was, how could I stay alive? Was there anything that I was doing in my life that had contributed to me getting sick? I mean, when, there are no atheists in foxholes. You start trying to find any way to survive that you can. And so that's what led me down this sort of, I call it a research path of how had I gotten organ cancer. Now, I want to just interrupt that and say in that same window of time, we would discover that my belly was paralyzed. I would not be able to return to my job, so I would have to resign from this new position that I held. I would not be able to afford the home that I was living in, so I would rent my house out, move into a fifth wheel to try to make ends meet, while also navigating a divorce, a couple of kids getting into college, a terminal diagnosis, and having to go 2 years clean from cancer. And this voice began to play in my head that said, you will never survive this. You don't have a husband. You don't have financial security. You can't afford your home. You're a loser. It will never change. And the voice of depression began to speak consistently and loudly in my life, which led me to a place of being tragically and desperately depressed. I will save the rest of that story for a little bit later, because I think you're probably going to ask me about compassion, and I'm going to tie that into this story. But when I survived that event, I began to research in earnest what was happening to the first responders. And what I did, Marcus, as funny as it's going to sound, is I covered my family room wall in butcher paper. I eventually got out of that trailer and back into my home, and I began to reverse engineer everything I could find that was affecting the first responders. And I started first with the neuroanatomy. The human brain begins to change its structure and shape based on repeated exposures to trauma and stress. And when your brain begins to change, it affects your psychology, it affects your emotions, those in turn affect your relationships. This can also affect you physically with the adrenaline and cortisol being dumped into your system. You add a little substance abuse and a pretty traditional problem with sleep, some sleep deprivation, and you have a recipe for suicide. And all of a sudden, I was putting together, holy cow, this is why we're dying. It's because all of these things are like a cascade of issues that are affecting us, and no one's talking about it. We're talking about behavioral wellness now. That's a pretty new subject. But in 2016, nobody was really talking about what was happening to the first responders, and everything that was offered to us was after we were broken, after we'd gotten busted for a DUI, after we stopped performing at our jobs, after we'd been out injured repeatedly, after we'd gone through our third divorce. They offered us medication, therapy, and early retirement. And I thought to myself, why can't we get ahead of this? If we can show the first responders why they're getting sick, why couldn't we stop this? And that's where this program began. I was so convinced that I could begin teaching first responders why physiologically they were being, this cascade of events was happening to them, and how to shut off their nervous systems so they didn't stay in this chronic state of fight or flight, which truly was injuring them, creating illness, contributing to divorce. All of that was because of what was happening to them physiologically. If I could show them how to stop it or turn it around, we could have a huge chance of keeping them alive, keeping them married, helping them find serenity and peace, all the things that I had discovered, that I was so compelled by this information that with the permission of my children, I want to throw that in there, I sold my house for the seed money to start this nonprofit. And that's what we did. I started talking to other first responders and saying, hey, I think I know what's killing us. I think we can turn this around. Here's what I've discovered. And I was like a crazy woman, right? I was like a crazy woman telling anybody who would listen. And in June of 2018, I hosted my first conference with 40 people in it, with the hope that it would be like a Flex hair commercial. So you still have hair, so this is kind of funny, but you're probably too young to remember the commercial. But the Flex hair commercial was, if you tell two friends, then they'll tell two friends, and so on and so on. And so I thought, if I could just get first responders to get the word out amongst each other, that we could train them how to improve their chances of surviving this industry intact, emotionally, physically, physiologically, relationally, all of that. And that's what we did. In June of 2018, I hosted my first conference with 40 people, and in June of 2023, we've trained just over 8,000 first responders and their family members.
That's an amazing, just numerologically, that is an amazing exponential increase. That is highly commendable, not just for the quality of the training, because if they're anything like my friend who came away from the training, life changed, but just purely for the business scalability to go from 40 people to over 8,000 in a couple of years. That's amazing. That's amazing. Congratulations on that.
Thank
and
you.
More than anything, you're saving lives. You're saving lives, right?
Yeah, I'm actually not saving lives. I'm teaching people how to save their own lives. I'm just giving them the information, and they're doing it for themselves. And that's the miracle, is I'm not selling a widget. I'm creating information to change a culture, because nobody who commits to a career in an industry where we're responsible for protecting and saving the structures and lives of other people should have their own lives destroyed as a result of their career choice. And I just want to show them there's another way.
There's a way to be more whole in ourselves and our relationships and our humanity.
Amen.
in our humanity. So that kind of brings about the question that we alluded to earlier. I always ask, this is the first question that my students write about every semester at Notre Dame, is to ask these pre-meds to just share a 2-page reflection about a time that someone was there for you or that you were there for another person. And I have to think, I mean, your whole career, 30-year career, plus what you're doing now, is you're always there for other people. But is there a specific story that comes to mind when you think of that prompt?
I absolutely. It's directly related to this program, and it's kind of what I alluded to before. And it's a humbling statement to make because there's so much traditional, or I should say societal shame around these kinds of conversations, but I don't care anymore, so I'm just going to say it. When I moved into that fifth wheel, and I'll probably get choked up, I got really depressed. I just felt like I'd lost everything. And I had made the decision to end my life. And on the day that I was going to do that, I had scripted the note that I was going to put on the outside of the fifth wheel for my brother to find, telling him not to let my children in and to call the sheriff's department. I'd planned the whole thing out. And I was laying on the bed in this trailer when a girlfriend I hadn't spoken to in 2 years called me. Now, the interesting thing was I hadn't spoken to anybody in probably 3 days. My kids were with their dad, and that's a desperate and isolated place to be. I'm sure there are plenty of first responders who've gone through divorce who've moved into a trailer to try to survive, so this may hit close to home. But for me, I couldn't tell anybody. And when people ask, why didn't you call me? Right? I know probably 700 first responders, and I couldn't. I didn't know even how to approach the subject. How do you say, gosh, hi, remember me? I was your supervisor, or I was a paramedic with you. Remember, we used to work together. Hey, listen, I've just gone through an unwanted divorce and a terminal diagnosis and major surgery, and I've moved out of my house and I'm living in my trailer. You want to go have a cup of coffee? Like, how do you even start that conversation? So I didn't tell anybody what was happening to me. I wished I would have, but I only know what I know today because I lived through it. And on the day that I had decided to end my life, this girl called me that I hadn't spoken to in 2 years. And the funny thing was, she had used to do my fingernails. She was my fingernail lady. So I always tell the first responders, if your wife is getting her fingernails done, just keep your mouth shut. That woman may save her life one day. Or man. So she said, hey, it's Nicole. What are you doing? And I think I just recognized my level of desperation. And I said, I'm laying in a fifth wheel thinking about killing myself. How about you? And she said, okay. You're going to be okay. I'm going to get you through this. Okay. I want you to hold on. Can you give me 5 minutes? Just give me 5 minutes. And this woman showed up like it was like a miracle. She said, I want you to just give me a few minutes. Do you belong to Kaiser? I know somebody there. I'm going to make a phone call. We're going to get you some help, okay? You just hold on. Just give me a chance. Can you just give me a few minutes? And I agreed to 10 minutes. I thought nothing's going to change in 10 minutes. I don't have to kill myself for 10 minutes. And she called back. And the next thing I knew, she had made arrangements for me to see a psychiatrist, which I had never seen a psychiatrist in my life. I ended up in about 3.5 hours later, I was in the office of this psychiatrist who asked me if I had any intentions of harming myself. And of course I lied because I'm a first responder and I know how to do that. And I thought, no chance in hell you're going to 5150 me, right? Which means a danger to myself or others. You're not going to institutionalize me. So I lied. And I said, absolutely, I have no plan. And yet, if I don't like the way this plays out, I will just go and jump off an overpass on the freeway. And she said, okay, no, we don't need to do that. I'm just asking. And I told her I would not allow her to 5150 me, but she asked me if I would consider being admitted to the hospital. I politely declined that offer, but I did agree to entering a 4-week intensive outpatient program. And that actually turned into a 4-month intensive outpatient program for me, where I learned for the first time in my life that I had no idea how to take care of myself. And so when I talk about compassion, I'm going to say this. That woman who called me that day, she called to have a conversation with a friend she hadn't seen in a couple of years. And what she ended up doing was saving my life. And that, for me, is both compassion and courage. She showed up where I needed her. She was there in the moment, and she met me where I was, and she held my proverbial hand until I was out of the woods.
And that's compassion, right? That's compassion.
That's compassion.
That's a big, that's a, I mean, the mystical power of that too, right? Just at the time, you're
Just at the time. 10 minutes, if she had waited 10 minutes, we wouldn't be telling this story.
it's kind of random, but I find so much teaching comes from music and lyrics, and I'm wondering if you're familiar with the Pink Floyd album called The Final Cut.
I'm familiar with the album, but I probably couldn't quote any of the songs.
It's exactly what you said. Just the last line of the song of the album is just then the phone rang and I never had the nerve to make the final cut. And that's when you learn the depth that these people, that the artist was in, and what they're trying to convey. And when you're telling this and you talk about the phone ring, I was immediately related to a Pink Floyd lyric. But I don't know if that album would hit a little too close to home for you, but it's one of those that kind of needs to be experienced while laying on the floor in the dark with headphones on.
Wow. You know, there's a lot of, I listen to a lot of music, and there are a lot of bands where the lead singers have suffered a lot of times through addiction, who share those kinds of stories about the insanity of being addicted and the insanity of wanting to hurt yourself. And it does look back, you know, when I look back today, it does sound like insanity. I'm a super optimistic, happy person. I love my kids. I've loved my life. And I can tell you that I honestly stood in judgment of the partners that I'd had who'd taken their lives. And I used to think, oh, how selfish. Don't they know how they're going to affect other people? They had children. How could they do that? But in the midst of depression, it's a physical pain. It's not just emotional. And all I was thinking to myself was, I just need the pain to stop. I can't carry this one more day. I just need the pain to stop. And so I speak to first responders from that space of darkness, saying that is a permanent decision around a temporary situation. And I know it because I've been there. And there is hope in healing. And I just said this to my daughter, Bailey. She's going to use this on her podcast. So I'm going to preemptively steal it back and use the line I said to her the other day. They say that necessity is the mother of invention. But I believe it's adversity that's the mother of invention. And out of that adversity, I was given a vision to build a center for first responders to help them have a healing space that I could not find at that moment. If I had known that there was somewhere in the world I could call and other first responders would answer the phone and say, it's okay, we've got you. You come right here and we're going to help you get yourself back into balance again. And so when I sold my home to start this nonprofit, it wasn't just to teach resiliency to first responders and their families, which is what we do, but it was to build the first responder resiliency center in the world to help them have a place that they could call their own, that gives them all the modalities and techniques and assistance and support that they need to get through the darkest windows of their lives, which can be very, very difficult, and most of us have no map and no flashlight when navigating those dark spaces. And so that's what I want to do out here. So ultimately, I didn't intend to train first responders across the country, which is what we're doing, obviously. What I really wanted to do, Marcus, was I wanted to build a resiliency center, a place for first responders and their families that they could go to, that they could have access to real-time support and assistance. I wanted to build a place that I needed. The phone call I wanted to be able to make where other first responders would answer the phone and say, we're here for you. We've got everything you need. Come on down. We've got access to a culturally competent therapist who understands what you do for a living. We have access to help for your family, workers' comp assistance, massage, meditation, encouragement, whatever it is, cancer support and research, even cold plunge and saunas and things that help stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, get you out of fight or flight, get you out of this mode where your brain is telling you you have nothing to live for. It's always going to be this way. It's like a rescue center. I call it a sanctuary for first responders and their families. And so that's what we did 2 years ago. We bought 18 acres in Northern California. I'm on a campaign to raise the money to build this first Responder Resiliency Center. And then I want to build 40 more across the country in the next 10 years. So any first responder in crisis or struggling has a place they can call their own. And it's a safe place.
How do people donate? How do people donate?
They can go, they can go to our website, which is resiliency, st.org. That is our website. And they can just tell their friends, right? I don't need one person to write a $15 million check. Although, if you're able to do that, I strongly encourage you to do so now. Do not stop. Do not pass go. But if, we just get a lot of people who are willing to make even regular small or moderate-sized donations, we're going to raise the money to build this center. And I've got the renderings done. I've had the soil tested. I've met with the engineers. I've got a contractor, several contractors who are willing to help us. And that's what I'm doing is I'm teaching this. My real dream is to change the culture. I don't want to sell a widget. I don't want to be known for having a product that everyone has to come back and buy 2 years later. I want to change the culture. We do not know, and we are not trained, that physiologically you are going to be impacted, whether you believe it or not, by the work you do. And we're going to show you how to avoid that. We are going to, our trademark is putting PTSD out of business, because number one, I do not believe it's a disorder. It's an injury. Nobody's born with PTSD. It's not a requirement that you get it. But boy, if you are serving people in trauma, you are going to get those symptoms. And it's a human condition. This is not unique to first responders, nor is it unique to veterans. But you cannot repeatedly traumatize people, and they avoid these symptoms. They sometimes distract themselves from the symptoms. They sometimes try to divorce themselves and their spouses to get away from the symptoms. They sometimes drink and medicate to avoid those symptoms, but they don't avoid them.
You don't avoid them. You're just numbing to them.
You're just numbing them.
Mm-hmm. Wow. In the time we have left, what do you most want first responders to know?
You're not broken. You're not crazy. If we can show first responders that the reason they feel so, the number one word I hear, the number one phrase I hear, Marcus, is, I'm numb. I don't feel anything. I'm not happy. I'm usually, I can be angry, I can be frustrated, but I don't have any joy in my life. And I believe that is entirely because your nervous system, your brain and your spinal cord have been in this state of fight or flight for so long that you don't even hear it. It's like having your hand in a garbage disposal. After a while, you just don't even notice that it's in there anymore because the rest of you is kind of going about business. And when people feel like it's never going to change, I'm stuck like this, I'm never going to really be happy again, I guess I have to medicate, get divorced, take my life, whatever it is, you're not crazy. You're not broken. Your nervous system is fried. And we can turn that around and we can give you your life back. And more importantly, we can teach you how you can get your life back. We're going to give you these skills so you can do the work. And if you choose to do the work, your life will be irrevocably altered. You will find the best version of yourself has been waiting for you at the doorway of your career. The best version of you is still there. It's still alive. It's still waiting for you. And we just show you the way back home.
Sue, I know that your focus is on first responders, but that's a good word for all of us right there, is trying to find our way back home.
We're just trying to find our way back home. And, Marcus, I don't know where we go with the rest of this podcast, but, you and I are two strangers at either sides of the country. I don't know you. You don't know me. We know that we have a common bond through our desire to help humanity. But as I mentioned, it came out of our own individual adversity. I would not trade my adversity for yours, nor do I think you would have wanted to give up a house, a husband, and half a kidney to start a nonprofit. But as I mentioned, that adversity is the mother of invention. And here you are with a podcast as a professor at Notre Dame, doing what you do, changing the world in your own way, helping healthcare providers learn about compassion and courage. And you as well are changing the world for the healthcare providers. Even though your journey was not my journey, it brought us to today, and that's a gift.
And your training seems so applicable even to me, who is not a first responder, but boy, am I interested in continuing to help myself heal. And whenever you say that a person's not broken, their nervous system is just fried, that hits right in the heart,
Yeah.
right in the cockles of the heart. That is the place where I realize we've all just got to take a step back. Mm-hmm. I know you're fond of saying we're not human doings, we're human beings.
That's right.
And I find myself getting caught up in the doing so much and the being not as much as I should be.
Yeah.
And your knowledge and wisdom have been helping me more than you know for the last several weeks.
Wow.
And I'm just really excited to continue this relationship down the road.
Me too. I really am. And I want to say, if it's okay, if I can add one more comment
Sure.
here. First responders, we're often very hesitant to talk to counselors, even though we're trying to make this more of a norm through behavioral wellness conversations. And, the fear that we'll look broken or weak or not able to do our jobs. And that oftentimes is what happens, is we don't end up in a therapist's office until we are at the bottom of the well. But it doesn't need to be that way. And the reality is we are, as somebody said to me the other day, tactical athletes. We are occupational athletes. We are just training first responders how to be stronger, smarter, and faster. They've already got everything they need inside of them. And as you said, and I'll circle back to this is a human condition. I just happen to speak to first responders because that's my industry. But anybody listening in on this, even by accident because a friend recommended it, will find that this is true for all of us. We just don't recognize, and no one's taught us. Hey, by the way, the most important part of you is your brain and spinal cord. Anybody teach you how to work with that? I thought not. And now we go about the business of changing the world together.
Let's do it. Sue, thank you so much. And listeners, thank you for being with us for this episode of Compassion and Courage, Conversations in Healthcare. I'm your host, Marcus Engel. This is the podcast where we teach compassionate communication, provide perspective, and inspire resilience. Please remember, for compassion consulting, for keynote speaking engagements, for narrative medicine work, please reach out to me at marcusengel.com. And if you have any guest suggestions too, we take that, marcus@marcusengel.com. Thank you all so much, and we will catch you on the next episode.
Thank you.